Brussels may be preparing to overhaul the EU's accession system that's been in place since the Cold War, with a controversial two-tier model, which would fast-track Ukraine's membership as part of a potential peace deal with Russia. According to reports, the Commission is considering a proposal that would scrap the traditional merit-based process, which requires candidate countries to align with the EU's acquis and complete all negotiation chapters before joining. Instead, countries would be allowed to enter the EU as secondary members, with limited rights until they fully meet the membership criteria. So in this video, we're going to unpack the two-tier model, and why it's proving to be pretty controversial. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's start with a bit of context. While the EU was built on the principle of equality among all member states, the idea of a tiered or multi-speed EU has a long history, which became particularly prominent around the end of the Cold War. In 1989, two senior German officials floated the idea of a Europe of concentric circles, in which a tightly integrated core would be surrounded by looser outer layers of participation. A few years later, a handful of former communist, Central and Eastern European countries began to outwardly seek EU membership. This triggered concerns among some Western European leaders that rapid enlargement could weaken political cohesion and paralyse decision-making. These fears were laid out bluntly in a 1994 paper by, again, two prominent German politicians, which called for a core Europe comprising Germany, France and Benelux, which would integrate more deeply and set the direction for the rest of the bloc. However, the idea proved controversial, especially among smaller states, who feared they would be relegated as secondary members. 2 decades later, in the wake of Brexit and growing internal divisions, exacerbated by the EU's requirement for unanimous decision-making in a number of key policy areas, the idea of a multi-speed Europe was revived by French President Emmanuel Macron. Then, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a renewed optimism for enlargement returned, and a multi-speed Europe was again proposed by Macron to unblock the EU's accession logjam. For context, the last time the EU admitted a member was Croatia in 2013, and a handful of candidate countries have been in the waiting room, some for over a decade. Since it's hard enough getting 27 individual states to agree on something, let alone the extra couple candidate states, Macron argued that new members could gradually integrate, joining parts of the EU such as the single market, customs union or education and energy programmes, before gaining full membership rights. The idea was to deliver tangible benefits early, keeping candidate countries motivated while full membership remained the ultimate goal. Somewhat predictably, in the nearly 4 years since Russia's invasion, EU officials couldn't come to agreement on reforming the accession rules. That was until seemingly last week, when the Financial Times reported that the idea of a two-tier Europe is once again on the table, this time as a renewed push to end the war in Ukraine. For context, drafts of a US-led 20-point peace plan include a key reference to Ukraine joining the EU in 2027. However, Ukraine's path to membership has faced significant obstacles. The country only became an official EU candidate shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, formally opening accession negotiations in June 2024. But progress stalled in June 2025, when Hungary blocked further talks, citing alleged discrimination against Ukraine's Hungarian minority. As a result, Ukraine has been unable to open a single negotiation cluster, despite the European Commission's assessment that it has met the prerequisites to open 3 of the 6 clusters. However, Hungary's veto is not the only factor stalling the process. Reform efforts in Ukraine have also been slow, particularly in the fight against corruption, and internal EU assessments suggest the country may require up to a decade of reforms to meet the accession criteria. As a result, some EU officials have argued that fast-tracking Ukraine's membership could give President Volodymyr Zelensky the political space to accept other elements of a potential peace deal, such as territorial concessions to Russia, by allowing him to present EU membership as a positive outcome. Dubbed as the EU Membership Light Plan, Ukraine would formally join the EU but without the full rights of membership. In practice, this would mean limited voting power and little influence in key ministerial decisions. Instead, Kyiv would gain phased access to the EU single market, agricultural subsidies, and additional development funding, with each step tied to meeting post-accession reform benchmarks. Once again, though, the idea of a tiered Europe is proving controversial, including with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. When asked in November about the prospect of candidate countries joining the bloc, initially without full voting rights, Zelensky responded cautiously, saying if we speak about EU membership, it has to be fully fledged, and that a country cannot be a semi or demi-member of the EU. Zelensky is not alone in his scepticism. Within the EU, some officials warn that the proposals could weaken the bloc's long-term unity, opening a Pandora's box of political risks and complications that Brussels may not be equipped to manage. Some also fear it would cheapen the value of membership and upset other candidate countries. Opinions are apparently split here. Some candidate countries insist they should get the bloc's full benefits, whereas others are happy just to be around the table. Moldova, for instance, whose membership application is twinned with that of Ukraine, isn't totally convinced, and nor is Montenegro, the candidate country which is the most advanced on its succession path. The small country of just over 500,000 people hopes to fully complete its vetting process by the end of this year, and, fearing changes would derail achieving full membership, is insisting that there's no need to change the rules at this point. On the other hand, Albania, which has now opened all of its negotiation clusters, is reportedly more than happy with this arrangement, and has even suggested letting the Italian European Commissioner represent Albania. The country's Prime Minister, Edi Rama, even said in an interview with Politico that he did not want to challenge the EU's big dogs, France and Germany, saying that, at the end, they are the adults in the family who make the important decisions. However, not all EU candidates like Albania and Montenegro have pursued a clear, committed path towards membership. Others, such as Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia, have struggled to meet EU criteria or maintain foreign policy positions aligned with the rest of Europe. This has led to some anxiety that the introduction of a two-tier Europe could discourage their accession ambitions, essentially leaving them in the proverbial waiting room as prime targets for further Russian influence. Now, you're probably looking to follow this story as it develops, but how are you supposed to keep track of which outlets online are actually trustworthy, and which are just fabricating a false narrative for you to follow? Well, that's where our sponsor this week, Ground News, comes in. That's because Ground News is a website and app that helps you make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. It can get increasingly overwhelming, with thousands of articles being thrown at us every day. But Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, helping you fully understand the story from start to finish. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each individual source. For instance, if we take this story on the EU wanting to change Ukraine's accession rules, we can see that there are 44 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the left. We can even dive into how each side is reporting by using their bias comparison feature, showing us that the left is framing it as an internal split and how a membership light plan spooks capitals, while the right criticises the process as a fast track and redefining the law for political ends. Our absolute favourite feature though is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your feed. So even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's good to know what's being left out of your bubble. You're probably used to being fed the news that the algorithm has decided is best for you, and breaking out of that spiral is harder than ever. Ground News will do that for you, freeing you from algorithmic restraints and letting you think freely again. So, if you want to start questioning the narrative instead of just consuming it, you can join Ground News today, and using our link will get you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.